welcome. This is the sort of continuation of our various topical institutes. We have explored a whole lot of topics in terms of the Middle East and North Africa in the world at various time periods. And of course, the long 19th century is a very important period. We're all, as we are world history teachers, often doing a marathon race by the time we get to the 19th century and the deadlines are approaching. But it's also extremely essential because there's hardly any topic you can think of in the 20th or 21st century that doesn't go back to the so-called long 19th century. And so with that, I would like to introduce Daniel Neep, who has been very kind to share as our beginning speaker approaches to the 19th century, long 19th century, and perhaps remind us why they call it that as a starter. So thank you. And you have bios of everybody, as you know, along with the syllabus and the agenda. So welcome, everyone. Let me just do one last thing, which is bring this and then minimize. She said I should bring it, but it's attached. So I guess it doesn't quite reach. Yeah, no. We'll
project.
yeah, that'll be great. Okay, let me just minimize these. Oh, you did? Yeah. Great. Okay, perfect.
Okay, well, Susan, thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Daniel Neep, and the title of my presentation, you can't quite see it, is New Approaches to the Long 19th Century, or Why Should We Care About the Ottoman Empire? I get a sense in which perhaps I am preaching to the choir, but you're not. And I have to say that if you're not a historian, most people don't actually care about the Ottoman Empire. This is an old story, if you like. And until a few years ago, I would have included myself in that category. Confession time, I'm not a historian. I've not taken a class. I never took a graduate class in history. I never took an undergraduate class in history. The last time I took a history class, I was 16 years old. I'm actually a political scientist, but I do historical work. What I'm interested in is the long-term transformation of states and societies in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly Syria and the Levant. That's my niche that I work in. And yet, as I say, despite the fact that I am one of the few historically minded political scientists, my first book was on colonial statehood in Syria, I nevertheless neglected the Ottoman Empire. The story we often tell about the Middle East is that the making of the modern Middle East began in World War I with Sykes-Picot and so forth. And over the last few years, and particularly drawing on a lot of the more recent historiography written about the Ottoman Empire, rethinking the long 19th century, one of my points that I'm trying to make in my conversations with other political scientists is that we should pay more attention to this. This isn't just, history is too important to leave to the historians. It actually continues to have enduring real world relevance today. So what I thought would be useful to do as my introductory talk to your workshop is kind of do the big picture argument, some of the big ideas and some of the key points to think about, to bear in mind as you go on through the week, and then perhaps raise some of the more specific questions with more focused presentations later on. So I'm doing the big picture stuff. As I say, I think that this question about caring about the Ottoman Empire is not simply an academic question. The sense in which the modern Middle East began in World War I is perhaps the key way in which not only academics and students, but also journalists think about the region. If you, there we go. If you think back a few years, back to when ISIS, Islamic State, was expanding across Syria and Iraq, and calling itself a kind of launching its emirate in a bid to erase the Sykes-Picot borders, to raise the modern borders of the national state and recreate an Islamic caliphate. The way in which this kind of echoed throughout the media, serious media, think tank discourse, was thinking about the dissolving of the Sykes-Picot borders in the region. We have here, is at the end of Sykes-Picot, that's Patrick Coburn in the London Review of Books, Rabinovich, The Ends of Sykes-Picot. It's all published within 2 or 3 years. The great unraveling we're making in the Middle East, Iraq and Syria no longer really exist. Yes, they still do. It turns out a few years later. That's interesting too. So there is this very real sense in which this idea of the Sykes-Picot borders continuing is used in contemporary discourse to explain many of the problems in the region. In short, the fact that the Middle East is supposedly divided into artificial states, which do not correspond with pre-existing ethnic, religious, national communities, forcing people to live in states with which they have nothing in common with their neighbors, could only be kept together by a strong man, Assad in Syria, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and as soon as the strongman disappears, then everyone goes back into sectarian warfare. This is, in essence, this is a kind of miniature version of the narrative. That's how people think about the region, as I say, and not only this type of discourse, but also in academics as well, particularly in their field of politics. I think this is really problematic, right, for a whole bunch of reasons. So I want to outline those quickly. First, you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the Sykes-Picot borders. And the first thing that historians will point out is that the Sykes-Picot borders were never actually implemented, of course. We forget this. It's a convenient symbol. It's a way we talk about these artificial boundaries. Originally, the blue areas were to be direct and indirect French rule. The red areas were to be British rule, direct British and indirect British rule, and then with Jerusalem being a kind of international area over here in what later became Israel. So, of course, these borders were never actually implemented. There we go. That's a little bit more, yes, Turkey famously managed to become independent and avoid colonialism completely. So it's an inexact historical narrative. And often it also overlooks some of the importance of local dynamics in determining these borders. Of course, people on the ground living in these regions were not completely passive in the face of French and British encroachment. The town of Deir ez-Zor in Syria, for example, in today's Syria, became Syrian because after the British withdrew, a bunch of what became Syrians decided belonged to Damascus rather than Baghdad. So there are small areas in which these borders were not imposed from outside, but of course, in the picture they were. Okay. Yeah, and then we have another map showing the same thing. So again, the sense in which the Sykes-Picot borders can explain the contemporary problems of the region is not something that's limited to journalism, but also comes up in the field of political science very often. These are two pretty well-used political science textbooks, which are used to introduce students to the study of the region. And if we look at what and they are historically minded, okay? They're not simply focusing on international relations since the Arab Revolution, since 9/11. They actually have a good historical depth to them in thinking about the role of colonialism, thinking about imperialism, and how that shaped, these forces have shaped the world today. And yet, if we look at what they actually say about the Ottoman Empire, Fred Halliday, okay, he does emphasize the legacy of the First World War era, and he talks about the empire's fitful and unsuccessful modernization efforts. He describes a protracted Ottoman retreat as being a prelude to the most dramatic and formative period of state formation in the Middle East. So for Halliday, the Ottoman Empire is a prelude. It kind of existed, it was weak, it got because of competition, it couldn't compete with the great powers, therefore collapsed. And then we had modern state building. So it takes the Ottoman Empire is prior to the processes of modern politics. Hinbush is the same. Hinbush talks about how, and again, he's talking about imperial competition, and this being the source of all problems. Hinbush says the Arab world was fragmented into a multitude of small states that were bound to be politically and militarily weak. This was all the more so because these states fitted very imperfectly with indigenous identity. Don't think he's using indigenous in the way that we use it here. But instead of the natural processes he talks about, instead of the natural processes of sorting out boundaries through war and dynastic marriage, I'm not sure what's natural about war and dynastic marriage, because this happened in Europe, right? Therefore it's natural. So instead of war and marriage, which took place in the northern world, the boundaries of the modern Middle East state system were arbitrarily imposed and frozen by the Western powers according to their own needs. Now, of course, we're not denying that large elements of this happened, but again, it's overlooking what happened in the prior period. History starts in World War I. Anything prior to that really didn't exist. And I think this is really puzzling to me for a whole bunch of reasons. I think there are problems with the Sykes-Picot narrative. Firstly, that it overlooks the fact that processes of state building predate World War I. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So some of the processes, if you think about being introduced by the European powers, were actually already underway in terms of state building, in terms of globalization, financialization, and so forth. The second problem with the Sykes-Picot narrative is that it draws our attention to ethnic and sectarian identities as being the real building block of problems in the Middle East. I think this is really problematic. The idea that these are mosaic societies filled with, in which people live in their own little ethnic enclaves and sectarian enclaves, have nothing to do with the neighbors, does not correspond with the lived reality of peoples in the region. Okay, and the idea of the mosaic society is actually a deeply colonial idea. So there are, with these ideas, you have to be extremely careful because, of course, they have an element of historical resonance because the borders were, in many cases, artificially imposed against the wishes of the people of the region. But things are more complicated than that. And overemphasizing these elements draws our attention to the idea that sectarian identity is the only thing that's relevant to the Middle East. Not class, not gender, not living in cities or countryside and so forth, not politics, not ideology. It draws our attention to the wrong thing. So, there we have the Ottoman Empire. There we go. Okay. So what I want to do is just I want to draw attention to a couple of the myths about the Ottoman Empire that are very widespread, particularly in political science and more generally, I think. The first of these is the notion of Ottoman decline. Okay, the idea that the Ottoman Empire, famously the sick man of Europe, was in this course of steady decline throughout the 18th and 19th century, was unable to compete militarily with European powers, Russia, of course, and therefore had its territories chipped away. That's what this map is showing up here, the kind of chipping away at different territories in North Africa, in the Balkans, and Central Asia, and so forth. This is often explained in terms of Ottoman decline. So straightforward, the Ottomans couldn't keep up, and therefore they lost this territory to European expansion. The idea of Ottoman decline has a really interesting genealogy. It first was actually discussed by Ottoman intellectuals themselves in the 16th and 17th century in a literary genre called the Nasihatname, advice. So it's a kind of advice to kings type literature, if you want. And what these Ottoman intellectuals were doing is critiquing the rulers of the time for introducing too much change, for being too flexible to the demands of new elites. And they started coming up with this criticism of the changes that were being introduced in terms of domestic decline. So it was a polemic term when it was introduced. It didn't really correspond to, it was a political analysis of the problems of the empire. The Ottoman intellectuals came for very specific purposes at the time. It was taken up about a century later in the 19th century by European intellectuals. We started looking around, European intellectuals started seeing that Russia was advancing on Ottoman territories. The Ottomans were losing militarily, so they started to look for explanations of what might cause that weakness. And what they found is this genre of literature talking about Ottoman society 100, 200 years ago, and really took it extremely seriously. They began translating it into European languages. They assigned it to train European diplomats. This is really interesting when you think about how these ideas and mechanics are actually disseminated and spread around the world. They're very precise. And it became the orthodoxy. A whole generation, several generations of European diplomats and thinkers were schooled in this idea. They were taught that this is, and it became from the region itself as well. It's not an outside imposition. It came from the region, and therefore it could seem more plausible. And what the Europeans did is, again, take this idea of Ottoman decline, but think about it more in terms of civilizations. Okay, they mapped it onto bigger debates about the rise and fall of civilizations in the 19th century, this kind of historical evolution of great powers and so forth, and mapped it on with these very 19th century ideas of progress, and used it as the key for understanding everything that was going on with the Ottoman Empire throughout the 19th century. Now, you'll say, okay, but again, two problems with this. Because the idea of decline became the master idea for thinking about Ottoman politics and history in the 19th century, it's also overturned by the fact that the Ottoman Empire did collapse in World War I. And in light of that, what people have tended to do is go back to the 19th century and look for hints and causes of what will explain that eventual collapse in 1914. Of course, in 1850 or 1860 or even 1910, it didn't look like the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. Of course, if you read back and look for the signs of decline, then everything you interpret as a weakness even though very often it was the Ottoman central state being more flexible, being more malleable, accommodating local demands in different places in different ways. So it's actually much more flexible. So this idea of decline becomes the kind of the key for thinking about it and limiting a thought about the region in that way. There's actually empirically, in terms of economic decline, there's a real mixed bag. It's really difficult to make generalizations about the economic decline of the Ottoman Empire before particular pockets of economic activity actually did very well at various points of the 19th century. And as a whole, economic historians are kind of spent a lot of time debating this. But the empirical record is actually extremely mixed too. And what the newer historiography does is, rather than concentrate on this period as one of decline, is to think about winners and losers. Who are the people who are able to take advantage of the opportunities that arise as international trade picks up? Which social groups are not able to take advantage, and to think about it as much more of a mixed bag of winners and losers. The second myth about the Ottoman Empire is that the story is one of failed modernization. And of course, in the Ottoman Empire, we had two major reform efforts: the Nizam-i-Jadid at the beginning of the 19th century and the Tanzimat in the mid-19th century. These were attempts at reforms to rationalize the Ottoman state, particularly in terms of tax collection. If you know about Ottoman tax farming, the idea being that the Ottomans farmed off or sold off at auction the right to collect taxes in certain places to influential local individuals, and they then could collect whatever taxes they want and keep it for themselves. So it wasn't a direct tax collection system as you would see in other countries. And because the Ottomans failed to develop this, they attempted to rationalize tax collection, they attempted to rationalize land reform and so forth. This is often seen again as being one of the explanations of internal weakness. But again, I think this is setting the bar a little bit too high. We're kind of complaining that the Ottoman Empire did not, by World War I, have achieved this Iberian, Prussian-style bureaucracy, which actually didn't exist in the USA either. We didn't have it here. And we're blaming the Ottomans for not becoming a fully Western state. Other states were also on this process of development. So I think it's setting the bar a little bit too high. And if you actually look at the impact, again, rather than characterizing these reforms as a failure, and look more nuanced way what was going on in particular localities, we get a really much more interesting picture. These land reforms they talked about, the whole idea being that peasants would be allowed to register land in their own individual names for the first time, thereby becoming investing in the land, putting money into it, expanding irrigation, improving the land, paying the taxes, easier to control if you know people's individual names, and so forth. I mean, this was a failure, as it turned out, across the board, because the notables, tribal chiefs, sheikhs, and so forth said, don't worry about anything, I'll register it to my name, and you're all good. You carry on working, you just pay me what you've always paid me. And so you had a huge landowning elite came into power directly as a consequence of this, and this elite dominated politics until the mid-20th century. But if you look, so on the face of it, yes, a failure, but in a more nuanced way, this language and sense of this changing land legislation also had very diverse impacts. In Mount Lebanon, for example, it inspired a revolt against landowners in the name of the peasants. In southern Syria, the peasants also fought back against the notables and were able to use the similar kind of language of that the Ottomans themselves had used in justifying these reforms. They used that language in order to justify their own claims to push back on the claims of the big landowners. So you have a much more diverse array of responses. Again, it's about looking at winners and losers in particular localities rather than one-size-fits-all explanation. So a few different ways of thinking about the Ottoman Empire that comes through from the historiography. The first is rethinking what type of polity the Ottoman Empire was. And instead of thinking about it as a failed modern state, we think of it as a survivor of the age of revolutions. From the 1760s through to 1840s, the old, late feudal, very centralized states, the British Empire, the French Empire, they started to, around the same time, suffer the same kind of difficulties of maintaining the kind of fiscal integrity, maintaining territorial control over wide stretches of territory, Many of these states failed themselves at this time. If you think about Britain, Britain was the ultimate failure because we lost the USA and the US became independent. So in that case, we had the breakup of the British Empire, if you think about it in that sense. We also had, in other cases, examples of regime change. If you think about France and the French Revolution, it again is a product of the same types of stresses that were going on around the world geopolitically. You know, and of course, the French not just had a revolution in mainland France, but also in Haiti as well. Haiti and the slave revolution years later. So you have these worldwide revolutions going on. What the Ottoman Empire did is actually they were a little bit more successful. They had some limited reforms within the Nizam al-Jadid, but which caused some pushback. They didn't go through enough far enough with reform and so forth. But as a response to the pressures at the time, this was actually very successful. So if we start thinking about the Ottoman Empire as not as a failure, but as a historical survivor at this moment, I think that's a good place to start. The other, in similar terms, the Ottoman debt problem, which again is marshaled into these explanations of the failure, the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. The Ottomans, in order to finance their major reforms, had to borrow increasingly large sums from British and French bankers, which they then borrowed more money, took out further loans to keep paying back at exorbitant interest rates. So the story that's told is often one about Ottoman debt. It's kind of a story of third world debt, isn't it, basically? You know, these countries cannot afford to keep themselves going, therefore they get themselves deeper and deeper in debt. And again, this feeds into the story of Ottoman crisis that ends in World War I. But what it neglects to say is that there is a global context to this whole financial crisis. It actually began with financial crises in Vienna and New York. Two initially disconnected financial bubble burst in Europe and in the USA, linked to the overexpansion of railroads. What this did is suck the credit out of markets in North America and Europe, causing a credit crunch, essentially. In that context, it became increasingly difficult for Ottomans to keep borrowing on the terms that they had previously done. So unless we actually start paying attention to the global and historical context of this debt problem, you know, it's like talking about, you know, the kind of Greek debt problem without thinking about the 2008 financial crisis. It just takes away this dimension of wealth going on in the world. We often forget that, you know, it's not only the Ottoman Empire that's defaulting. So 10 out of 13 Latin American states also default on their debt at this time. Greece defaults on debt. Portugal defaults on debt. This is not a Middle Eastern pathology. There's something going on in the whole world around this time that causes these problems. So again, thinking about the Ottoman Empire in this kind of global historical context is extremely important. And it's not something we ever do. You know, Middle East, I definitely safe in saying political scientists don't know about this. You know, they're not aware of the fact the depression that took place after these financial crises, which lasted about 20 years, it was so big that at the time they called it the Great Depression. That was how profound it was. And it impacted all across the Middle East as well, because the Middle East was already exporting grain, and so forth. After we had the Great Depression, they renamed it the Long Depression. Helps keep it in check. You know, but we're not aware of these global contexts. And I think increasingly we need to pay them attention. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is how the changing infrastructures that expanded and unfolded during the 19th century are really important in laying the basis for changing social and political identities in the Middle East. And this is where it kind of gets more interesting, and the connection to today is more relevant. Because one of the arguments of the Saxe-Picot narrative is that these are artificial states, they don't connect with real identities, and real identities are doing something else. And yet, when Britain and France came in after World War I, they didn't encounter a blank slate. There were already processes of historical change taking place in the region. So I want to talk briefly about two of these regions, Bled Hashem, the kind of Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, if you like. And we often kind of gloss this area as being the Levant, being Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Israel and Palestine. But of course, the actual Bled Hashem is a little bit narrower than that. It's kind of this ribbon, if you like, of inhabitable area clinging to the Eastern Mediterranean. You go much further to Further east of Amman and Damascus, you hit desert, okay? So it's a relatively narrow strip of land, which at the time is mostly known as what swamps in Palestine, really difficult mountain areas, up and further along the coast in Syria, deeply impoverished peasantry living up there, and so forth. And I think it's in previous centuries, it would be accurate, I think, to characterize this area as a kind of archipelago of cities and small towns, relatively disconnected, not completely disconnected, of course, because obviously there are trade links, family ties, religious connections and so forth, but relatively disconnected, certainly in terms of how we think about a modern integrated national state today. What happens following the 1840s, after the Ottomans sought to reassert their control over this region, is that there was, first of all, in tandem with this expansion of kind of Ottoman state reforms, you also have an expansion of physical infrastructure. The journey between Damascus and Beirut used to take 3 days, 3 or 4 days to go between the two, which is absolutely crazy now if you think about how quickly you can go over that by car. After a new road was built in the 1860s, it actually cut that time to 13 to 14 hours. So all through the region, you have this beginnings of new infrastructure connecting cities in different ways. The late 19th, early 20th centuries, we have a railroad built by the French and by the Ottomans themselves, stretching down. We have a telegraph network that is built that eventually connects and spreads further down from Istanbul all the way down to Aleppo, Damascus, Haifa, and so forth. Telegraphs are really important, not only because they can spread news, spread instructions, spread warnings of bandits and recalcitrant tribes attacking people and caravans and so forth, but they can also spread things like, when does Ramadan begin? When does the Ottoman Empire say we start fasting? When should we be doing, in terms of standardizing, rationalizing times and so forth, this is actually really important for that as well. So this standardization, if you like, is taking place at this time. And around the same time, Europeans who are becoming more interested in this region for geopolitical reasons reintroduced the name Syria. The name Syria is originally Greek. Europeans start using this term as a way to talk about this kind of awkward space between the Holy Land and what is now southern Turkey. Start talking about Syria. It wasn't a name used very much. It wasn't used in Arabic prior to that. But in the mid-19th century, Arabic intellectuals start picking up on this name because they're finding it really useful. Because they have this changing sense of connection themselves, they start to think about Syria as being a name to link these different places. And of course, it's not today's Syria. This whole area, this narrow tranche of the elites, start writing histories of Syria, start writing regional histories for the first time, as well as just histories of individual cities. So you can see and start using this term amongst themselves and feeding into this kind of efflorescence of Arabic literature and thought that begins in the late 19th century as well. So you have these beginnings of Arabic speakers imagining themselves as part of a distinct community, one that's based in this new region of Syria and one that is built on these changing connections. If you think about Iraq, in contrast, yes, I should mention, of course, the Ottomans also create a province called Syria for the first time. This is actually a name that the Ottomans are using themselves in one of their many administrative reshuffles during this time. Again, these kind of, they're messing around with these borders and changing them. They're not static. If you remember prior to the Iraq War, I can't say that to my students because students don't remember prior to the Iraq War. But if you remember back then, in the media, the idea was always, Iraq's an artificial state. They put together 3 Ottoman provinces that never had anything to do with each other. That's all part of the reason that they were bad, of course, not for any other reason. But of course, even these provincial boundaries were shifting at the time as well, moving around in different ways. They weren't static. As far as Iraq goes, of course, the difficulty is that Iraq, in terms of the Ottoman governance, is extremely far away. This is not, Baghdad is not a posting you want. It takes days and days to reach there if you go over land. It's full of tribes who are not pacified, who are not fully under Ottoman controlled, very dangerous to get there. It's incredibly, no air conditioning, incredibly hot in the summer, very difficult to host. The Ottoman diplomats, governors who have posted there are complaining about this place all the time. And of course, road building is much more challenging. So what they did is concentrate on steamships and introducing steamships into Iraq as a way to connect and dredging the river and making it more navigable and so forth. You also have in Iraq, similarly, you have the name Iraq. It had always been used since medieval times, at least. And again, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you've got examples of Iraqis using the term Iraq and we Iraqis, okay? Perhaps not including as much the northern parts of Iraq, but certainly Baghdad and cities further south. So these ideas of local regional communities are already there and are changing as the region is becoming more sucked in to changing global economic patterns and so forth. I feel like I've been talking a long time. So I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of takeaways. Okay, so again, why should we care about the Ottoman Empire? Have a cheat sheet, if you like. Firstly, World War I understates the role of outside powers, right? And the idea of putting it in this global longer context is not that we stop talking about Britain and France, but we actually start thinking about how did, even when the Ottoman Empire was still there, how did the global context in terms of debt, how did changing patterns of trade affect different parts of the region? And we actually start thinking seriously about what did it mean in the 1840s and 1850s when Britain started flooding the region with cheap goods? You know, what did that do to local producers and so forth? So it's not taking away the importance of Sykes-Picot, it's just putting it in this longer context. It helps us get away from the idea of Middle Eastern exceptionalism. Okay, very often, particularly those of us who focus and spend a lot of time working on the region, fall into this trap, even when we don't mean to, if the Middle East is special, the Middle East is unique, it's not like other parts of the world. Well, yes, but so is every part of the world. Every part of the world is unique and special, okay? And putting it in this global context, we start thinking about transformations going in other parts of the world and putting them side by side. If we start thinking about the Ottoman Empire as in terms comparable to the old French Empire, the old British Empire, but it survived, for example, this helps us get away from that and get a better understanding of what's going on. And again, what was interesting for me when I started reading this literature as someone who was new to it, and so much great work being done on the Ottoman Empire in the last 20 years, it's absolutely the growth area in Middle East history, I would say. Please no more books about agrarian history in Egypt in the late 19th century. There's a lot of stuff out there. But a lot of it is really familiar in terms of the topics that we come across when we look at the long 19th century. These ideas of financial crisis, first wave of globalization going on in the late 19th century. It's very familiar to 21st century years. A lot of the dynamics which were taking place for the first time in the 19th century continue to be relevant today, I think. And perhaps, if we are suggesting, and I think I'm suggesting that many of the problems in the region do have this longer term historical roots. Only if we go a little bit further back, we really get a sense of what they are and how deeply ingrained they are in the region. And at the same time, if we start digging back a little bit deeper and think about how these identities have deeper roots than we assumed, it helps explain why, in 10 years after, several years now after ISIS has been disappeared, why Syria and Iraq do still exist, despite the fact that Syria has undergone brutal, terrible, bloody war for 10 years. It still exists as a country. Syrians still want to keep Syria as a country. They don't want to dismember it. Iraqis still, speak to this place called Iraq. And I think by taking this longer-term perspective into account, it helps us explain a little bit better the reasons for that. What explains these continuities as well as discontinuities in the region. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much.